In 1984, Grace Harbor Orphanage vanished overnight. 104 children, 12 staff members, all gone without a trace. The official story? A gas explosion. But there were no bodies, no debris, no flames. Just an empty lot where laughter once echoed through the halls. 25 years later, Detective Olivia Jackson discovers a hidden journal that shatters everything she believed about the disappearance. What she uncovers isn't just a cold case. It's a conspiracy that reaches into her own family's darkest secrets. Some mysteries are buried for a reason, and some truths are more terrifying than any lie. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are, and subscribe to our channel to receive new stories every day that will thrill your heart. I hope you enjoy the story. The legend of Willow Creek, Pennsylvania, wasn't the kind that children whispered around campfires or teenagers dared each other to investigate on Halloween nights. This was the kind of legend that made grown men cross themselves when they drove past the empty lot on Maple Street, where twisted iron gates still stood guard over nothing but overgrown weeds and the crumbling foundation stones of what had once been Grace Harbor Orphanage. The locals didn't speak of it often, but when they did, their voices dropped to barely audible whispers, and their eyes would dart nervously toward the skeletal remains of the building that had vanished into local folklore. 104 children had called Grace Harbor home. Their ages ranged from barely walking toddlers with gap-toothed smiles to sullen teenagers counting down the days until they could escape the system entirely. 12 staff members had dedicated their lives to caring for these forgotten souls. Nuns with calloused hands and tired eyes, maintenance workers who knew every creaky floorboard and leaky pipe, kitchen staff who stretched meager budgets to fill hungry bellies night after night. On a bitter February evening in 1984, when snow fell like ash from a pewter sky and the wind howled through the bare branches of the oak trees surrounding the property, every single one of them simply ceased to exist. The official report, filed by the Pennsylvania State Fire Marshal and corroborated by the local gas company, painted a picture of tragic accident. A catastrophic gas leak in the building's aging infrastructure had led to an explosion so complete, so devastating, that it had reduced the entire 3-story brick structure to nothing more than scattered debris and ash. The bodies, the report claimed, had been incinerated beyond recognition or recovery. Case closed. Families notified. Insurance claims processed. The site was cleaned, the debris hauled away, and within 6 months, it was as if Grace Harbor Orphanage had never existed at all. But the people of Willow Creek knew better. They had heard no explosion that night, seen no flames painting the horizon orange. Some claimed they had witnessed strange lights dancing through the windows in the hours before dawn, lights that moved with purpose rather than the chaotic flicker of fire. Others swore they had seen buses, unmarked, windowless vehicles that had never appeared in any official record, pulling away from the property under cover of darkness. The gas leak story was convenient, neat, and utterly insufficient to explain the complete absence of debris, the lack of scorch marks on the surrounding trees, or the way the very earth seemed to have been sanitized of any trace that children had ever laughed and cried within those walls. For 25 years, Grace Harbor remained a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered by parents to keep their children from wandering too far from home. The empty lot became a place where teenagers dared each other to spend the night, where ghost hunters set up their equipment and recorded nothing but the sound of wind through broken fence posts, where real estate developers drew up plans that invariably fell through, due to mysterious financing issues or sudden changes of heart. Dr. Adam Grant had never been one to believe in ghost stories. His world was built on facts, documentation, and the careful preservation of historical truth. At 38, he had already made a name for himself as a meticulous historian, specializing in Pennsylvania's industrial era. A man who could spend hours poring over census records and newspaper clippings with the same intensity others reserved for their favorite novels. His office at Willow Creek University was a testament to his obsessive nature. Filing cabinets arranged with military precision, books alphabetized and cross-referenced, and a desk so organized that his colleagues joked he could find a specific document in the dark. It was on a particularly dreary Tuesday morning in September 2009 that Adam's methodical world intersected with the legend of Grace Harbor. He had been commissioned by the County Historical Society to compile a comprehensive record of defunct institutions in the area, a project that required him to dig through boxes of records that had been gathering dust in basement archives for decades. The musty smell of old paper and fading ink had become as familiar to him as his morning coffee, and he approached each new box with the patient enthusiasm of an archaeologist uncovering ancient treasures. The box marked "Religious Institutions, Closed" contained the usual assortment of documents: incorporation papers for churches that had lost their congregations to suburban sprawl, financial records from parochial schools that had closed due to declining enrollment, and correspondence between various diocesan offices. Adam worked through the materials with his characteristic thoroughness, photographing each document and making careful notes in his leather-bound journal. It was near the bottom of the box, beneath a stack of yellowed photographs from a church picnic, circa 1962, that his fingers encountered something unexpected. The manila envelope was unremarkable except for its thickness, and the fact that someone had taken great care to seal it with multiple layers of tape that had yellowed and cracked with age. There was no marking on the outside, no indication of what it might contain. Adam's pulse quickened slightly as he carefully worked the tape free with a letter opener, his historian's instincts telling him that something this carefully preserved was likely significant. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by countless hands, and its pages filled with the precise flowing handwriting of someone educated in an era when penmanship was considered a reflection of character. The first page bore an inscription in faded blue ink: "The private records of Sister Mary Beatrice Morrison, Director, Grace Harbor Orphanage, January 1978, February 1984. Adam's breath caught in his throat. He had stumbled upon something that, according to official records, should not exist. Every document related to Grace Harbor had supposedly been destroyed in the explosion, yet here was irrefutable proof that someone had taken great care to preserve at least a portion of the institution's history. His hands trembled slightly as he turned to the first entry, dated January 15, 1978, which began with Sister Beatrice's arrival at Grace Harbor and her initial impressions of the facility and its residents. The early entries were routine, documenting the daily challenges of running an underfunded orphanage, struggles with maintenance issues, efforts to secure adequate nutrition for the children, and the constant battle to provide educational opportunities with limited resources. Sister Beatrice wrote with obvious compassion about individual children, noting their personalities, their struggles, and small victories. 8-year-old Timothy, who had finally stopped wetting the bed after months of patient encouragement. 12-year-old Sarah, whose artistic talents were beginning to bloom despite her traumatic past. 15-year-old Marcus, who had shown remarkable leadership qualities and was being considered for a scholarship program. But as Adam read deeper into the journal, the entries began to take on a more troubling tone. References appeared to meetings with unnamed officials, discussions about special assessments of certain children, and increasingly frequent mentions of something called reclassification protocols. Sister Beatrice's handwriting grew more cramped and hurried, and her entries began to include coded references that Adam couldn't decipher. Children who had been mentioned regularly in earlier entries would suddenly disappear from the narrative with no explanation, their absence noted only by cryptic phrases like "T has been selected for enhanced placement," or "S transferred per Protocol 7. The most disturbing entries began appearing in late 1983. Sister Beatrice wrote of visitors arriving at odd hours, men in dark suits who spoke in hushed tones with the facility's board of directors. She described feeling increasingly isolated from decision-making processes, receiving directives from superiors who seemed to have no understanding of the children's individual needs or circumstances. Her entries revealed a woman slowly realizing that the institution she had dedicated her life to serving was being transformed into something she no longer recognized or understood. The final entries, dated in the weeks leading up to the disappearance, were barely legible. Sister Beatrice's careful handwriting had deteriorated into an urgent scrawl, filled with references to something called Project Ether. She wrote of children being taken for medical evaluations that lasted days, of buses arriving under cover of darkness, of her own growing certainty that something unspeakably wrong was happening within the walls of Grace Harbor. Her last entry, dated February 23, 1984, just 2 days before the official date of the explosion, contained a single, chilling sentence. "God forgive me. I should have acted sooner. The children deserve better than what we have become." Adam sat back in his chair, the journal trembling in his hands. The musty archive room suddenly felt claustrophobic, the afternoon's sunlight filtering through dusty windows seeming inadequate to dispel the shadows that Sister Beatrice's words had cast across his understanding of what had happened at Grace Harbor. This wasn't the story of a tragic accident. It was evidence of something far more sinister, a conspiracy that had been covered up for 25 years. His academic training warred with his growing horror as he considered the implications. If Sister Beatrice's account was accurate, then the official story was a lie. 104 children hadn't died in an explosion. They had been taken, transferred to some unknown fate as part of a program that operated in the shadows of legitimate child welfare services. The very thought made his stomach churn, but his historian's instincts demanded verification, corroboration, and most importantly, justice for those who had been forgotten. Adam carefully photographed every page of the journal before sealing it in an archival-quality protective sleeve. His hands shook slightly as he reached for his phone, knowing that this call would transform Sister Beatrice's private anguish into an official investigation. The number for the Willow Creek Police Department was programmed into his contacts. He had worked with them before on historical research projects, but this call would be different. This time he wasn't seeking assistance with academic research. This time, he was reporting what appeared to be evidence of crimes that had remained hidden for a quarter century. Detective Olivia Jackson had built her career on her ability to remain skeptical of extraordinary claims, while remaining open to unexpected evidence. At 42, she had spent nearly 2 decades with the Willow Creek Police Department, working her way up from patrol officer to senior detective through a combination of meticulous attention to detail and an almost supernatural ability to recognize when someone was lying to her. She had investigated everything from domestic disturbances to drug trafficking, but she had never expected to find herself confronting ghosts from her own family's past. When Adam Grant arrived at the police station that afternoon, clutching a manila envelope like it contained the crown jewels, Olivia's first instinct was professional courtesy tinged with mild skepticism. Academics occasionally brought them interesting historical curiosities, but they rarely had any bearing on active criminal investigations. She settled into the interview room across from the obviously agitated historian, her notebook open and her expression neutral, prepared to listen politely before explaining why a 25-year-old journal probably fell outside the department's jurisdiction. Adam's presentation was methodical and compelling. He laid out the timeline of his discovery, provided context for the official records of Grace Harbor's destruction, and carefully explained why Sister Beatrice's journal represented a potential breakthrough in understanding what had really happened to those missing children and staff members. Olivia found herself leaning forward as he read selected passages aloud, her detective's instincts recognizing the ring of truth in the nun's increasingly desperate observations. But it was when Adam opened the journal to a page near the end that Olivia's professional detachment evaporated entirely. Taped to the page was a black-and-white photograph, slightly faded but still clear enough to show a group of teenage girls standing in front of Grace Harbor's main building. They were dressed in identical dark dresses, their hair neatly braided, their expressions ranging from shy smiles to teenage sullenness. At the far right of the group stood a girl who couldn't have been more than 16, her dark hair catching the sunlight, her eyes bright with intelligence and barely suppressed mischief. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. The face staring back at her from the photograph was achingly familiar, identical to one she had seen in her family's photo albums since childhood. The girl in the picture was an exact match for her Aunt Rebecca, her father's younger sister who had died in a car accident in 1984 at the age of 17. The resemblance was so perfect that for a moment, Olivia wondered if somehow a family photograph had made its way into Sister Beatrice's journal. But the caption beneath the image, written in the nun's careful script, identified the girl as Margaret Thompson, age 16, resident since 1978. Olivia's mind raced as she stared at the photograph. Her Aunt Rebecca had never been in an orphanage. She had grown up in the same small house where Olivia's father had been raised, cared for by loving grandparents who had told countless stories about both their children. Rebecca had been killed in a car accident on a rainy night in March 1984, just weeks after the Grace Harbor incident. The family had grieved her loss for decades, visiting her grave every year on the anniversary of the crash. But the girl in the photograph was undeniably Rebecca, not someone who looked like her, not a distant relative who shared similar features, but Rebecca herself. The small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood fall, the distinctive way she tilted her head when posing for pictures, even the slight gap between her front teeth that she had been self-conscious about, every detail matched Olivia's memories of her beloved aunt. The implications hit her like a physical blow. If Rebecca had been at Grace Harbor under a false name, then everything Olivia's family believed about her aunt's life and death was a lie. The car accident that had supposedly killed her had occurred just weeks after the orphanage had exploded, a timing that could hardly be coincidental. Had Rebecca somehow escaped whatever fate had befallen the other residents? Had she been trying to return home when she died? Or was her death connected to the same conspiracy that had swallowed Grace Harbor whole? Olivia's hands trembled as she looked up from the photograph to meet Adam's concerned gaze. The case had just transformed from historical curiosity to personal crusade. Somewhere in the official records of Grace Harbor's destruction and her aunt's death lay answers to questions that her family had never known to ask. The ghost story of Willow Creek had reached across 25 years to reclaim one of its own, and Olivia Jackson was going to make sure that this time, the truth would not be buried in convenient lies and official explanations. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the interview room as Olivia made her decision. This wasn't just about justice for 104 missing children anymore. It was about Rebecca, about family secrets that had been hidden for a quarter-century, and about the possibility that the girl she had grown up believing was her tragic deceased aunt had actually been a survivor of something far more sinister than a simple car accident. The investigation into Grace Harbor Orphanage was about to become very personal indeed. The partnership between Detective Olivia Jackson and historian Adam Grant had formed out of necessity rather than choice. Two professionals from vastly different worlds, united by their shared horror at what Sister Beatrice's journal had revealed. Their makeshift command center occupied a corner of the police station's conference room, where photocopied pages from the journal were spread across multiple tables like pieces of a macabre puzzle. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as they worked through the night, subsisting on bitter coffee and the growing conviction that they were uncovering something far more sinister than either had initially imagined. Adam approached the documents with the methodical precision of an academic, creating detailed timelines and cross-referencing entries with historical records. His laptop screen glowed with spreadsheets tracking the disappearances, patterns emerging from what had initially appeared to be random selections. Olivia, meanwhile, applied her detective's instincts to the evidence, looking for the human motivations behind the clinical language that filled Sister Beatrice's later entries. Together, they began to piece together a picture that made both of them question everything they thought they knew about institutional childcare in 1980s Pennsylvania. The documents revealed a systematic scheme that was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. Children who arrived at Grace Harbor healthy and psychologically normal were subjected to a process that Sister Beatrice had euphemistically termed reclassification. Medical records showed perfectly healthy children being diagnosed with an ever-expanding catalog of mental disorders, learning disabilities, and behavioral problems that would make them eligible for specialized treatment programs. The progression was always the same. A child would arrive, undergo extensive evaluation, receive a diagnosis that hadn't existed in their previous records, and then be flagged for transfer to what the documents referred to as enhanced therapeutic interventions. The medical assessments were signed by a rotating cast of psychiatrists and psychologists, but one name appeared with disturbing frequency throughout the files. Dr. Julian Croft's signature was a constant presence, his flowing handwriting authorizing diagnoses that transformed bright, curious children into candidates for experimental treatment protocols. His evaluations were masterpieces of clinical manipulation, using legitimate psychological terminology to justify decisions that served some hidden agenda rather than the children's well-being. Adam's research into Dr. Croft's background revealed a man whose credentials were impeccable on paper, but whose career trajectory raised troubling questions. He had graduated from prestigious medical schools, completed his residency at respected institutions, and published papers on child psychology that were cited in academic journals. Yet his work at Grace Harbor represented a dramatic departure from conventional practice, with diagnoses that seemed designed to remove children from the general population rather than treat their actual needs. Olivia's law enforcement databases provided additional context that made the pattern even more disturbing. Dr. Croft had worked with multiple institutions throughout Pennsylvania during the 1980s, always in consulting roles that allowed him to evaluate children without taking primary responsibility for their ongoing care. His involvement consistently coincided with unusual numbers of children being transferred to facilities that existed in bureaucratic gray areas, institutions that received government funding but operated with minimal oversight. The more they learned about Dr. Croft, the more convinced they became that he held answers to questions that had haunted Willow Creek for 25 years. If anyone could explain what had really happened to the children of Grace Harbor, it would be the man whose signature had authorized their removal from normal institutional care. Olivia used her police credentials to locate his current address, while Adam researched his recent activities to determine the best approach for their interview. Dr. Croft, they discovered, was now 73 years old and living in apparent retirement in an upscale suburb 40 minutes from Willow Creek. Property records showed he owned a modest but well-maintained colonial house on a tree-lined street where children rode bicycles and neighbors waved to each other from perfectly manicured lawns. Public records indicated he had withdrawn from active practice 5 years earlier, citing health concerns, though he maintained his professional licenses and occasionally served as an expert witness in custody disputes. They planned their approach carefully, agreeing that the interview would require delicacy, given Dr. Croft's age and the sensitive nature of their questions. Olivia would lead the conversation, using her authority as a police detective to legitimize their inquiry, while Adam would provide historical context and ask follow-up questions about the institutional relationships that had made the Grace Harbor transfers possible. They scheduled the meeting for a Thursday morning, giving themselves time to prepare questions that might prompt Dr. Croft to reveal information he had kept hidden for decades. But 24 hours before their planned visit, Olivia's desk phone rang with a call that would change everything they thought they understood about their investigation. The voice on the other end was carefully disguised, artificially roughened in a way that suggested the caller was making a deliberate effort to avoid recognition. The message was brief and cryptic, delivered in the tense cadence of someone who believed they were being watched. The caller's words sent a chill through Olivia's body that had nothing to do with the police station's aggressive air conditioning. The voice warned that Dr. Croft was preparing to speak, that decades of silence were about to be broken, but that whatever they found when they reached him should not be trusted at face value. The implication was clear. Someone else knew about their investigation, someone with access to information about Dr. Croft's intentions and the power to act on that knowledge. Olivia tried to keep the caller on the line, asking questions that might reveal their identity or provide additional context for the warning. But the voice simply repeated the cryptic message about not trusting what they would find. Adding a final observation that made her blood run cold, the caller suggested that the truth about Grace Harbor was more dangerous now than it had been 25 years ago, that forces were still active and would not hesitate to protect their secrets through any means necessary. The line went dead, leaving Olivia staring at the phone with a growing sense of urgency that bordered on panic. She immediately tried to trace the call, but it had come from a prepaid cellular phone that provided no useful information about the caller's identity. The timing of the warning, coming just hours before their planned meeting with Dr. Croft, suggested that their investigation was being monitored by people who had both the resources and the motivation to stay ahead of law enforcement inquiries. Adam noticed the change in Olivia's demeanor immediately. The way her usual professional composure had been replaced by a tightly controlled anxiety that made her movements sharp and purposeful. When she explained the contents of the anonymous call, he felt his own academic detachment giving way to something approaching fear. They were no longer simply researching historical events. They were actively threatening people who had managed to keep their secrets buried for decades and who apparently retained the power to silence those who came too close to the truth. Despite the warning, or perhaps because of it, they decided to proceed with their visit to Dr. Croft's house. The anonymous caller had suggested that the doctor was preparing to reveal information, which meant their window of opportunity might be closing rapidly. If Dr. Croft was indeed ready to break his silence about Grace Harbor, they needed to reach him before anyone else could intervene to prevent that revelation from occurring. The drive to Dr. Croft's neighborhood took them through suburbs that gradually became more affluent, past shopping centers and office complexes that represented the modern prosperity that had grown up around the ghost stories of places like Grace Harbor. Olivia drove while Adam reviewed his notes, both of them unconsciously checking their mirrors more frequently than usual, alert for any sign that they were being followed. The anonymous warning had introduced an element of paranoia into their investigation that neither of them was entirely prepared to handle. Dr. Croft's street embodied the American dream of suburban tranquility, with neat houses set back from the road behind well-tended gardens and mature oak trees that provided dappled shade on the autumn morning. Children's bicycles lay scattered on front lawns, and the only sounds were the distant hum of lawn mowers and the cheerful barking of dogs. It was the kind of neighborhood where serious crimes were rare enough to make the local newspaper's front page, the kind of place where secrets could be hidden behind facades of respectability and community involvement. The house at 847 Maple Street was unremarkable in its middle-class propriety, a two-story colonial with white vinyl siding and black shutters that had been maintained with the obsessive care of someone who took pride in appearances. The front lawn was perfectly edged, the flower beds showed evidence of recent weeding, and a late-model sedan in the driveway suggested that Dr. Croft was indeed at home. Everything about the scene spoke of normal, peaceful retirement, making what they found inside all the more jarring by contrast. Olivia's police training kicked in the moment she noticed that the front door was slightly ajar, hanging open just enough to reveal a strip of the darkened interior beyond. No homeowner in this security-conscious neighborhood would leave their door open on a Thursday morning, particularly not someone who might have reason to fear unwanted visitors. She drew her service weapon with practiced efficiency, signaling Adam to stay behind her as they approached the entrance with the careful steps of people who understood that they might be walking into an active crime scene. The interior of the house was dimly lit, with heavy curtains drawn against the morning sunlight, and an oppressive silence that seemed to absorb sound, rather than simply reflecting its absence. The air carried a mixture of scents, coffee growing cold, the lingering aroma of breakfast, and underneath it all, the metallic tang that experienced police officers learned to associate with violence. Olivia moved through the room systematically, her weapon ready, while Adam remained by the door as instructed, his academic instincts warring with a growing certainty that they had arrived too late. They found Dr. Julian Croft in his study, slumped over an antique wooden desk that had been positioned to take advantage of natural light from a large window overlooking his backyard garden. The scene was arranged with theatrical precision, every element positioned to tell a specific story about what had transpired in the room. A small-caliber pistol lay in his left hand, his fingers still curled around the grip in a way that suggested it had been placed there after death rather than gripped by a living person preparing to end their life. The suicide note was positioned prominently on the desk, written on expensive letterhead in the same flowing handwriting that had authorized so many questionable diagnoses 25 years earlier. The text was a masterpiece of calculated confession, admitting to unspecified wrongdoing at Grace Harbor while providing just enough detail to satisfy investigators without revealing the true scope of what had occurred. Dr. Croft's final words, according to the note, expressed remorse for his role in harming children and his inability to live with the weight of his guilt any longer. But Olivia's trained eye immediately recognized the inconsistencies that transformed an apparent suicide into obvious murder. The pistol in Dr. Croft's left hand contradicted everything else in the room, which showed clear evidence of right-handed usage. His coffee mug sat to the right of his chair. His reading glasses were folded on the right side of the desk. And most damaging of all, the suicide note itself had been written with his right hand. The same flowing script that appeared in thousands of medical evaluations over his long career. The positioning of the body told an even more disturbing story. Dr. Croft's head had fallen forward onto the desk in a way that suggested he had been unconscious or already dead when the gunshot wound was inflicted. There was no blood spatter pattern consistent with a self-inflicted gunshot, no powder burns on his hands or clothing, and no signs of the final struggle that typically accompanies suicide by firearm. Someone had killed Dr. Julian Croft, and then arranged the scene to suggest he had taken his own life out of guilt over his role in the Grace Harbor conspiracy. The realization hit Olivia with the force of a physical blow, transforming their historical investigation into an active murder case with implications that reached far beyond academic curiosity. The anonymous warning had been accurate. Dr. Croft had indeed been prepared to speak about Grace Harbor, and someone with the resources and motivation to prevent that revelation had acted with deadly efficiency. The doctor's death wasn't the end of their investigation. It was proof that the conspiracy they were uncovering remained active and dangerous 25 years after Grace Harbor's disappearance. Standing in that carefully arranged death scene, Olivia felt the full weight of what they had stumbled into settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. The case that had begun with Sister Beatrice's hidden journal had evolved from historical mystery to active threat, involving people who possessed both the will and the ability to commit murder in order to protect secrets that should have been buried with the victims of 1984. The 25-year-old question of what had happened to the children of Grace Harbor had been replaced by a more immediate and terrifying inquiry. Who was still pulling the strings, And how far would they go to keep the truth from coming to light? The carefully staged suicide of Dr. Julian Croft wasn't an act of desperate guilt. It was a calculated murder designed to eliminate a potential witness while providing a convenient explanation for his death. The conspiracy that had swallowed Grace Harbor whole was still alive, still active, and still willing to kill to protect its secrets. The investigation had just become a race between justice and a shadow organization that had been covering its tracks for decades and showed no signs of slowing down now. The murder of Dr. Julian Croft had transformed their investigation from historical inquiry into a deadly game of cat and mouse. But Olivia Jackson refused to let fear derail their pursuit of the truth. The staged suicide had only confirmed what Sister Beatrice's journal had suggested, that the Grace Harbor conspiracy involved people with both the resources and ruthlessness to eliminate threats to their carefully constructed cover story. If anything, the doctor's death had intensified her determination to uncover what had happened to those children, including her Aunt Rebecca, whose face continued to haunt her thoughts during the sleepless nights that followed their grisly discovery. Adam Grant approached the continued investigation with the methodical persistence that had made him a respected historian, though the academic detachment that had once characterized his work had been permanently shattered by the sight of Dr. Croft's lifeless body arranged in that macabre tableau. The knowledge that they were pursuing people who killed to protect their secrets had introduced an element of personal danger that no amount of archival research had prepared him for. Yet he found himself unable to abandon the quest for truth that had consumed his thoughts since that first glimpse of Sister Beatrice's desperate handwriting. The search of Dr. Croft's house had required careful coordination with the county coroner's office and the state police, who were treating the scene as a potential homicide despite the apparently obvious suicide scenario. Olivia's reputation with local law enforcement allowed her to guide the investigation toward evidence that might have been overlooked by investigators focused solely on the immediate circumstances of the doctor's death. While crime scene technicians processed physical evidence, she and Adam were granted supervised access to examine Dr. Croft's personal papers for anything that might shed light on his connection to the Grace Harbor disappearances. The doctor's study revealed the meticulous record-keeping habits of a man who understood that documentation was both protection and potential liability. Filing cabinets contained decades of patient records, research notes, and correspondence with medical colleagues, all organized with the obsessive precision of someone who knew that his professional reputation depended on maintaining detailed records of his activities. But it was in a locked drawer of his antique desk, secured with a combination lock that yielded to Adam's patient manipulation, that they discovered the evidence that would reshape their understanding of Project Ether entirely. The drawer contained a leather-bound appointment book that covered the period from 1978 to 1985, its pages filled with cryptic notations that used initials rather than full names and coded references that suggested Dr. Croft had been deeply aware of the sensitive nature of his activities. More revealing was a manila folder marked Institutional Correspondence that contained carbon copies of hundreds of letters exchanged between Dr. Croft and administrators at facilities throughout Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. The letters used clinical language to discuss the placement and therapeutic monitoring of specific children, but the cumulative effect of reading them in sequence was to reveal a network of institutions that operated in coordination to facilitate the movement of vulnerable children between facilities. The correspondence revealed that Project Ether was far more extensive and sophisticated than they had initially imagined. Rather than being a single location where children were taken for unknown purposes, it was a carefully orchestrated network of institutions that shared resources, expertise, and most disturbingly, human subjects for what the letters euphemistically described as longitudinal behavioral studies. The children transferred from Grace Harbor hadn't disappeared into a single facility. They had been distributed among dozens of institutions that collectively formed a research apparatus designed to study the effects of systematic psychological trauma on developing minds. Each letter in Dr. Croft's files represented a child whose life had been fundamentally altered by decisions made in clinical language by professionals who viewed them as research subjects rather than human beings deserving of protection and care. The correspondence detailed the specific therapeutic interventions that would be applied to individual children, using medical terminology to describe procedures that were clearly designed to inflict psychological damage rather than provide healing. References to ego dissolution protocols, attachment disruption therapy, and isolation-based conditioning painted a picture of systematic abuse disguised as legitimate medical research. The true horror of Project Ether began to emerge, as Adam cross-referenced the institutional names mentioned in Dr. Croft's correspondence with his historical databases. Many of the facilities had operated under multiple names over the years, changing their official designations whenever public scrutiny became too intense or regulatory oversight threatened their operations. What appeared to be separate institutions were often interconnected through shared funding sources, overlapping administrative structures, and the rotation of staff members who brought their expertise in psychological manipulation from one facility to another. The network included facilities that presented themselves to the outside world as progressive treatment centers for troubled youth, isolated boarding schools that promised to help children with behavioral problems, and medical institutions that claimed to specialize in innovative therapies for mental health disorders. But Dr. Croft's correspondence revealed that these seemingly legitimate operations were fronts for research programs that viewed children as laboratory specimens rather than patients deserving of care and protection. Olivia's law enforcement contacts proved invaluable in tracking down the current status of the institutions mentioned in Dr. Croft's files. Many had closed over the years, their operations terminated when public investigations threatened to expose their activities, or when changes in government funding made their programs financially unsustainable. Others had evolved into new organizations with different names but similar operating principles, their staff members carrying forward the techniques and philosophies that had characterized the original Project Ether network. The pattern that emerged from their research was both systematic and horrifying. Children who had been transferred from Grace Harbor and similar institutions had been subjected to research protocols designed to test the limits of psychological endurance through carefully calibrated applications of trauma, isolation, and emotional deprivation. The studies weren't seeking to create enhanced human beings or train specialized operatives. They were exploring how completely a child's personality and sense of self could be dismantled through prolonged exposure to institutional cruelty. Their investigation led them to a defunct facility in rural West Virginia that had operated under the name Serenity Hills Residential Treatment Center from 1975 to 1992. State records indicated that it had been closed following an investigation into allegations of patient abuse, though the official reports had been sealed by court order, and the details of what had occurred there remained classified. The facility's remote location, nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forests and accessible only by a single unpaved road, had provided the isolation necessary for conducting experiments that could never have been carried out under public scrutiny. The drive to Serenity Hills took them through increasingly desolate countryside, past abandoned farms and rusted industrial equipment that spoke of a region that had been bypassed by economic prosperity and forgotten by public attention. The facility itself had been empty for over 30 years, but the buildings remained largely intact, their institutional architecture preserved by the dry mountain air and the absence of vandalism that might have occurred in a more populated area. Walking through the empty corridors of Serenity Hills was like stepping into a monument to systematic cruelty. The building's layout revealed design choices that had prioritized surveillance and control over comfort or healing. Dormitory rooms were windowless boxes, barely large enough to contain a narrow bed and a small desk, their doors equipped with external locks that could confine occupants for extended periods. Common areas were arranged to prevent privacy or intimacy, with furniture bolted to floors and walls painted in institutional colors that seemed calculated to drain hope from anyone forced to spend time in these spaces. But it was in the basement that they discovered evidence that transformed their understanding of Project Ether, from theoretical horror into documented reality. A series of rooms that had clearly been designed for isolation contained file cabinets that had been abandoned when the facility closed, their contents preserved by the building's dry conditions and the remote location that had prevented scavenging. The files contained detailed records of experiments conducted on children whose ages ranged from 8 to 17, documenting procedures that had been designed to systematically destroy their subjects' psychological resilience through carefully orchestrated trauma. The clinical reports were written in the dispassionate language of scientific research, describing human suffering with the same detachment that might be applied to laboratory animals. Children were referred to by numbers rather than names, their responses to various forms of psychological torture documented with meticulous precision. The experiments included prolonged isolation in soundproof chambers, systematic disruption of sleep patterns, deliberate cultivation of paranoia and mistrust, and the methodical destruction of every relationship or source of comfort that might provide psychological stability. Reading these reports was like witnessing systematic evil disguised as medical research. The researchers had approached the destruction of children's minds with the same methodical precision that legitimate scientists might apply to curing disease, documenting their subjects' deterioration with clinical fascination rather than human compassion. The studies revealed that Project Ether's true purpose had been to explore the mechanisms by which institutional environments could be used to completely remake human personality, stripping away every aspect of individual identity to create subjects who were completely dependent on their captors for basic psychological survival. The most disturbing aspect of the research was its apparent success. Progress reports documented children who had arrived at facilities like Serenity Hills with normal psychological profiles, but who had been systematically transformed into hollow shells of their former selves through prolonged exposure to institutional cruelty. The researchers had developed techniques for inducing learned helplessness, destroying children's ability to form attachments, and creating psychological dependency that made their subjects incapable of functioning outside the controlled environment of the institution. Adam found himself physically ill as he read descriptions of children who had been deliberately driven to psychological breaking points and then rebuilt according to specifications determined by their captors. The research represented a perversion of legitimate psychological science, using established principles of behavioral modification to inflict maximum damage on developing minds. The children of Grace Harbor hadn't been sold to mad scientists conducting exotic experiments. They had been fed into a machine designed to systematically destroy everything that made them human. Standing in that abandoned basement, surrounded by evidence of crimes that had been disguised as medical research, Olivia felt a rage building in her chest that threatened to overwhelm her professional composure. These weren't crimes of passion or desperation. They were calculated acts of cruelty committed by educated professionals who had perverted their training to serve an agenda that viewed children as disposable research materials. The clinical language couldn't disguise the fact that Project Ether had been nothing more than a systematic program of child torture, conducted under the protection of institutional authority and scientific legitimacy. The realization that her Aunt Rebecca had likely been subjected to these horrors added a personal dimension to her fury that made it difficult to maintain the emotional distance necessary for effective investigation. Somewhere in these files might be records documenting Rebecca's transformation from a normal teenager into whatever she had become before her death in 1984. The thought that someone she had loved and mourned might have spent her final months enduring the calculated cruelty described in these clinical reports filled Olivia with a determination to see justice done that went far beyond professional obligation. The scope of Project Ether's operations became clear as they continued their investigation into the network of institutions that had participated in the research. Government funding records revealed that the program had operated with official sanction at the highest levels, receiving financial support from agencies that were interested in understanding how institutional environments could be used to control and modify human behavior. The research had applications beyond child welfare, providing insights that could be applied to prisoner rehabilitation, military training, and intelligence operations that required the systematic breaking down and rebuilding of human personality. The horror of Project Ether wasn't just its cruelty toward individual children. It was the revelation that systematic psychological torture had been conducted with official approval and scientific legitimacy. The network of institutions had operated openly, publishing sanitized versions of their research in academic journals and presenting their findings at professional conferences. The destruction of children's minds had been treated as a legitimate field of scientific inquiry, protected by institutional authority and funded by government agencies that saw value in understanding how human beings could be systematically broken and remade according to external specifications. Standing in that basement archive, surrounded by evidence of institutionalized evil, Olivia understood that they had uncovered something far more horrifying than a simple conspiracy to hide criminal activity. Project Ether represented a systematic perversion of the institutions that society had created to protect vulnerable children, transforming places that should have provided healing and safety into laboratories for the scientific study of human suffering. The children of Grace Harbor had been fed into a machine designed to destroy everything that made them human, and that machine had operated with the full knowledge and approval of the authorities who should have protected them. The musty basement of Serenity Hills had yielded countless horrors, but nothing had prepared Olivia Jackson for the manila folder that Adam discovered wedged behind a rusted filing cabinet. forgotten in the facility's hasty abandonment decades earlier. The folder bore the embossed letterhead of Riverside Memory Research Institute, a name that had appeared only briefly in Dr. Croft's correspondence, but now revealed itself as the epicenter of Project Ether's most disturbing achievements. As Olivia's trembling fingers opened the yellow documents, the fluorescent light flickering overhead cast dancing shadows across pages that would transform her understanding of family, identity, and the very nature of human consciousness. The first document was a transfer report dated February 28, 1984, bearing the clinical signature of Sister Mary Beatrice Morrison. The report detailed the relocation of Subject 847 from Grace Harbor Orphanage to Riverside Memory Research Institute for what it euphemistically termed advanced therapeutic intervention. But attached to the transfer papers was a black-and-white photograph that made Olivia's world tilt on its axis. Her Aunt Rebecca, but not the Rebecca of family memories and cherished photographs. This Rebecca sat rigid in an institutional chair, her eyes vacant and unfocused, her hands folded with the unnatural stillness of someone whose spontaneous movements had been systematically suppressed. The accompanying medical evaluation, written in Sister Beatrice's increasingly desperate handwriting, revealed why Rebecca had been selected for this particular fate. Unlike the other children who had been broken by Project Ether's initial psychological interventions, Rebecca had demonstrated what the nun described as remarkable resilience to trauma-based conditioning and exceptional memory retention capabilities. While other subjects had fractured under systematic abuse, Rebecca had somehow compartmentalized her suffering, maintaining core aspects of her personality that made her both fascinating and frustrating to her captors. Dr. Helena Marchfield's correspondence with Sister Beatrice painted a picture of scientific excitement barely contained within clinical language. The letters described Rebecca as the ideal candidate for what they called the Memory Reconstruction Protocol, a procedure that represented the culmination of decades of research into the malleability of human consciousness. The goal wasn't simply to break Rebecca's will, as had been done with countless other children, but to completely erase her original identity and replace it with an artificially constructed personality that could function seamlessly in normal society. The process had been documented with the meticulous precision of a laboratory experiment, each phase of Rebecca's psychological destruction catalogued in reports that read like a surgeon's notes on a particularly complex operation. Phase 1 had involved the systematic suppression of her memories through a combination of experimental pharmaceuticals and intensive psychological conditioning. Sessions lasting up to 18 hours had been conducted in sensory deprivation chambers, where Rebecca's consciousness had been bombarded with contradictory stimuli designed to fragment her sense of reality and personal continuity. Olivia found herself physically nauseated as she read the clinical descriptions of her aunt's ordeal. The reports detailed how Rebecca's memories of Grace Harbor, her life before the orphanage, and eventually even her own name had been chemically erased from her consciousness through the careful application of experimental drugs that induced selective amnesia. Each successful deletion had been celebrated as a breakthrough in the understanding of memory formation and storage, with researchers documenting their techniques for potential application to other subjects. Phase 2 had been even more disturbing. The construction of an entirely artificial identity, designed to replace Rebecca's erased memories with a coherent but fabricated personal history. The researchers had approached this task with the creativity of novelists and the precision of computer programmers, crafting a backstory that would explain Rebecca's presence in whatever community they selected for her placement. They had given her false childhood memories, implanted emotional connections to people she had never met, and created personality traits that would make her attractive to potential romantic partners while ensuring her compliance with their monitoring protocols. The correspondence revealed that Rebecca's artificial personality had been designed with specific objectives in mind. She was programmed to be nurturing but not overly curious, intelligent but not analytical, and emotionally available while maintaining psychological barriers that would prevent her from forming the deep connections that might lead to uncomfortable questions about her past. Every aspect of her reconstructed identity served the researchers' need to create a subject who could function normally in society while remaining under constant surveillance. Dr. Marchfield's letters documented the painstaking process of selecting the perfect community for Rebecca's placement, analyzing demographic data and social structures to identify a location where she could integrate seamlessly, while her behavior could be monitored and documented. The choice of Willow Creek had been deliberate, a small town with limited economic opportunities, where newcomers were welcomed without excessive scrutiny, and where the research team could establish a network of observers without arousing suspicion. The monitoring protocols revealed the true scope of Project Ether's ambitions and resources. Rebecca's placement in Willow Creek had involved the recruitment of dozens of community members who had been paid or coerced into serving as unwitting observers, documenting her social interactions, emotional responses, and psychological development. Her landlord had been instructed to report on her domestic habits. Her co-workers had been asked to monitor her professional relationships, and even casual acquaintances had been recruited to provide feedback on her integration into local social networks. But the most devastating revelation came in a series of letters discussing Rebecca's relationship with Olivia's family. The correspondence revealed that her grandfather's financial difficulties in the early 1980s had been artificially created by Project Ether operatives as a mechanism for ensuring the family's cooperation in their experiment. The sudden resolution of these problems, coinciding with Rebecca's arrival, had been payment for their participation in providing her with a family environment where her artificial personality could be tested and refined. Olivia's hands shook as she read clinical assessments of her own father's psychological profile, analyzing his emotional vulnerabilities and predicting how he would respond to having a sister whose fabricated memories included a childhood they had supposedly shared. The researchers had studied her grandparents' parenting patterns and social connections, determining that they possessed the combination of desperation and emotional availability that would make them ideal hosts for their reconstructed subject. The letters detailed how Rebecca's artificial personality had been programmed with specific behavioral triggers designed to integrate her into the family structure. Her genuine affection for Olivia's father, her ability to recall shared childhood experiences that had been implanted during her reconstruction, and her apparent contentment with her new life had all been manufactured responses carefully calibrated to create authentic emotional bonds while serving the researchers' observational objectives. Reading through years of surveillance reports, Olivia began to understand that every family gathering, every holiday celebration, and every moment of apparent happiness had been observed and analyzed by people who viewed human emotion as raw data for their research. Rebecca's laughter at family dinners had been documented for insights into the stability of artificially implanted personality traits. Her tears at sentimental moments had been studied for evidence of emotional authenticity in reconstructed consciousness. Even her relationships with family pets had been analyzed for signs that her artificial personality could form genuine attachments. The correspondence included detailed discussions of Rebecca's romantic relationships, with researchers monitoring her dating patterns and emotional responses to determine how successfully their artificial personality could navigate intimate human connections. When she began seeing Olivia's father more seriously, the researchers had intensified their surveillance, eager to document whether artificially reconstructed subjects could form the deep emotional bonds necessary for long-term relationships and potential reproduction. The decision to allow Rebecca's relationship with Michael Jackson to progress to marriage had been made by committee, with researchers weighing the scientific value of studying artificially implanted personalities in domestic relationships against the potential risks of their experiment being discovered. The wedding itself had been attended by multiple Project Ether operatives posing as distant relatives and family friends, their presence documented in photographs that Olivia now realized contained the faces of people who had been studying her family rather than celebrating with them. The final phase of Rebecca's story revealed the calculated cruelty that lay at the heart of Project Ether's research methodology. The car accident that had supposedly claimed Rebecca's life in 1984 had been neither accidental nor fatal. It had been a carefully orchestrated extraction designed to remove her from the community, before any inconsistencies in her fabricated memories could be discovered. The researchers had wanted to study the grieving process of families who had formed genuine emotional bonds with artificially reconstructed subjects, documenting how deeply their psychological manipulation had succeeded in creating authentic human connections. Rebecca hadn't died in that accident. She had been taken back into Project Ether custody for what the correspondence described as post-integration analysis and memory archival. The letters revealed that she had spent her final months in a research facility where her artificially implanted memories were systematically extracted and cataloged. Her emotional responses to family separation were documented, and her reconstructed personality was gradually dissolved through the same techniques that had created it. Her actual death had occurred in a laboratory, surrounded by researchers who viewed her final moments as data points in their study of artificially created human consciousness. Standing in that abandoned basement, surrounded by evidence of systematic psychological torture disguised as medical research. Olivia felt the foundations of her identity crumbling beneath the weight of revelations that transformed every cherished family memory into a lie designed to serve scientific objectives. The aunt she had mourned for decades had never really existed. She had been an artificial personality created by researchers who had studied human love and grief as measurable phenomena to be manipulated for experimental purposes. The realization that her entire family's emotional landscape had been shaped by Project Ether's agenda extended beyond the horror of Rebecca's fate to encompass the manipulation of her own development and identity formation. The family stories that had shaped her childhood understanding of loss and resilience, the emotional connections that had influenced her career choice and personal relationships, and even her capacity for forming deep human bonds had all been indirectly influenced by researchers who had treated her family as unwitting subjects in their exploration of psychological manipulation. Adam watched helplessly as Olivia processed the implications of what they had discovered, her professional composure dissolving under the weight of evidence that her most fundamental assumptions about family and identity had been constructed through deliberate deception. The investigation that had begun with her desire to uncover historical truth had become a journey into the artificial construction of her own emotional reality, revealing that the people she had trusted most had been unwitting participants in an experiment that had shaped every aspect of her personal development. The truth about Rebecca wasn't just a revelation about past crimes. It was evidence that Project Ether's manipulation of human consciousness had extended into Olivia's own life through the systematic destruction and reconstruction of someone she had loved. The woman who had influenced her understanding of family loyalty and emotional resilience had been a fabrication designed to serve research objectives, making Olivia both investigator and indirect victim of the same psychological experimentation that had destroyed countless other lives. The discovery of Rebecca's true fate had shattered Olivia's understanding of her family's history. But the deeper they excavated the archives of Project Ether's network, the more horrifying the revelations became. Hidden within a subsidiary folder marked Post-Integration Monitoring Protocols were documents that transformed what they had thought was the conclusion of Rebecca's story into merely its beginning. The memory reconstruction protocol hadn't been an end in itself. It had been preparation for an even more ambitious and terrifying phase of experimentation that extended across decades and generations. Adam's historian instincts had led him to cross-reference the dates in Rebecca's file with broader Project Ether documentation, searching for patterns that might reveal the scope of the memory reconstruction program. What he found was a comprehensive tracking system that had monitored not just Rebecca's integration into normal society, but every aspect of her subsequent life with the methodical precision of a long-term scientific study. The files revealed that Project Ether's researchers had viewed Rebecca's successful personality reconstruction as merely the first phase of an experiment designed to test whether artificially created identities could produce offspring who would carry forward specific psychological traits. The post-integration monitoring files documented Rebecca's relocation to Willow Creek with clinical detachment, describing how researchers had selected the community specifically for its demographic characteristics and social isolation. The town's economic struggles in the mid-1980s had made it an ideal location for Project Ether's purposes, providing a controlled environment where Rebecca's activities could be monitored without arousing suspicion from residents who were too concerned with their own survival to pay close attention to newcomers. Dr. Marchfield's correspondence detailed the elaborate infrastructure that had been established to maintain surveillance over Rebecca's reconstructed life. The monitoring network included strategically placed observers who had been inserted into positions throughout the community, shopkeepers who documented her purchasing patterns, landlords who reported on her domestic activities, healthcare workers who tracked her physical and psychological well-being, and social contacts who had been specifically recruited to form relationships with her for research purposes. The files contained detailed psychological profiles that had been compiled through years of covert observation, documenting every aspect of Rebecca's personality as it developed within the framework of her artificial identity. The researchers had been particularly interested in her emotional responses to various situations, her decision-making patterns, and her capacity for forming genuine human connections despite the artificial foundation of her reconstructed consciousness. Each interaction she had with community members had been carefully documented and analyzed for insights into how completely her fabricated personality had integrated with her underlying psychological structure. But the most disturbing revelation came in a section marked Reproductive Phase Monitoring, which detailed Project Ether's plans for the next stage of their research. The files revealed that Rebecca's integration into Willow Creek society hadn't been random. She had been placed there specifically because demographic analysis had identified it as a location where she would be likely to form a romantic relationship and produce offspring. The researchers had been eager to study whether children born to subjects with reconstructed personalities would exhibit specific psychological traits that could be attributed to their parents' artificial identity programming. The selection of Rebecca's partner had been as carefully orchestrated as every other aspect of her reconstructed life. Michael Jackson, Olivia's father, had been identified through psychological profiling as an ideal candidate for the experiment. A man whose own emotional vulnerabilities and social isolation would make him susceptible to forming a deep attachment to Rebecca, while remaining unlikely to investigate inconsistencies in her personal history. The researchers had manipulated circumstances to ensure their meeting, documenting their courtship with the same clinical precision they applied to laboratory experiments. Olivia's hands trembled as she read the detailed analysis of her parents' relationship, realizing that even their love story had been artificially constructed as part of Project Ether's research agenda. The files contained intimate details about their interactions that could only have been gathered through extensive surveillance, conversations that had taken place in the privacy of their home, personal moments that should have been beyond the reach of external observation, and emotional exchanges that had been analyzed for their research value, rather than respected as expressions of genuine human connection. The birth announcement in Olivia's file was marked with clinical significance rather than celebration, documenting her arrival as Subject 011, and describing her genetic inheritance as a combination of her father's documented psychological profile and her mother's artificially reconstructed personality traits. From the moment of her birth, she had been designated as a test subject whose development would be monitored to determine whether Project Ether's psychological manipulation could be transmitted across generations through environmental conditioning and genetic predisposition. The early childhood monitoring reports read like a perverted version of a baby book, documenting her developmental milestones not with parental pride, but with scientific interest in how her inherited traits manifested in her behavior and cognitive abilities. Every aspect of her upbringing had been observed and analyzed. Her first words, her social interactions with other children, her academic performance, and her emotional responses to various situations. The researchers had been particularly interested in her problem-solving abilities and her capacity for analytical thinking, traits that they hypothesized might be enhanced versions of characteristics that had made her mother such a successful subject for memory reconstruction. The files revealed that Rebecca's death in the car accident hadn't been the tragic conclusion to her story that Olivia's family had believed. It had been a planned termination designed to test how the loss of her reconstructed mother would affect Subject 011's psychological development. Project Ether's researchers had wanted to study whether the trauma of losing Rebecca would activate specific behavioral patterns or accelerate the development of investigative instincts that they believed might be transmitted through the combination of genetic inheritance and environmental programming. The monitoring reports from Olivia's adolescence documented her grief process with clinical detachment, analyzing how the loss of her mother had influenced her personality development and career aspirations. The researchers had been particularly pleased to observe that the trauma had indeed seemed to activate enhanced analytical abilities and a compulsive need to seek truth and justice, traits that they viewed as confirmation of their theories about psychological inheritance and environmental conditioning. Reading through decades of surveillance reports about her own life, Olivia began to understand that every significant event in her personal and professional development had been observed, analyzed, and potentially manipulated by people who viewed her as a living experiment, rather than a human being deserving of privacy and autonomy. Her decision to pursue a career in law enforcement hadn't been a personal choice. It had been a predicted outcome that Project Ether's researchers had anticipated and encouraged through subtle environmental influences designed to guide her toward their desired behavioral patterns. The files contained detailed analyses of her police training, her case clearance rates, her investigative techniques, and her psychological responses to various types of criminal activity. Every aspect of her professional development had been documented as data points in an ongoing study of how artificially enhanced psychological traits could be transmitted across generations and developed through targeted environmental conditioning. Even her romantic relationships hadn't escaped scrutiny, with Project Ether's observers documenting her emotional attachments and analyzing them for insights into how her inherited psychological profile influenced her capacity for intimacy and trust. The researchers had been particularly interested in her tendency to maintain emotional distance from romantic partners, viewing this pattern as potential evidence that Rebecca's artificially reconstructed personality had created psychological barriers that were being transmitted to the next generation. The most devastating revelation came in the form of a comprehensive evaluation report, dated just months before their investigation began, which documented Project Ether's assessment of the multi-generational experiment's success. The report concluded that Subject 011 had developed exactly as predicted, exhibiting enhanced investigative abilities, analytical thinking, and an obsessive pursuit of truth that represented the successful transmission of artificially enhanced psychological traits across generations. The report's final recommendation was that the experiment should be allowed to continue indefinitely, with ongoing monitoring to document how Subject 011's enhanced abilities would manifest in her professional achievements and potentially be transmitted to any offspring she might produce. The researchers expressed particular satisfaction that their subject had chosen a career in law enforcement, viewing her professional success as validation of their theories about psychological enhancement through multi-generational programming. Adam watched in horror as Olivia processed the implications of what they had discovered, her entire sense of personal identity crumbling under the weight of evidence that her life had been shaped by forces she had never suspected existed. The investigation that had begun as a quest to uncover historical crimes had revealed that she wasn't just investigating Project Ether. She was living within its ongoing experimental framework, a second-generation test subject whose every achievement had been anticipated and documented by researchers who viewed her as confirmation of their most ambitious theories. The surveillance reports contained references to dozens of individuals who had played roles in her life, without her knowledge that they were actually Project Ether operatives, teachers who had guided her academic development, colleagues who had influenced her career decisions, and even friends who had been positioned to observe and report on her social and emotional development. The realization that her entire social network had been penetrated by people whose primary loyalty was to a research project rather than genuine human connection left her feeling completely isolated and betrayed. Standing in that basement archive, surrounded by evidence of decades of manipulation and surveillance, Olivia understood that she faced a choice that went beyond simply seeking justice for the children of Grace Harbor. She could either accept that her entire life had been shaped by Project Ether's agenda and continue living within their experimental framework, or she could attempt to break free from a system of control that had been designed to be virtually undetectable and inescapable. The files suggested that Project Ether's researchers were still active, still monitoring, and still documenting her responses to new information and challenging situations. Even her investigation into Grace Harbor might have been anticipated and incorporated into their ongoing study of how second-generation subjects would respond to discovering the truth about their origins. The possibility that her pursuit of justice was itself being studied and manipulated added another layer of horror to revelations that had already shattered every assumption she had held about her personal autonomy and individual identity. The final document in her personal file was a research proposal for the next phase of the multi-generational study, suggesting that Project Ether's researchers were interested in observing how Subject 011 would respond to learning about her status as an experimental subject. The proposal indicated that they had anticipated this moment of revelation and were prepared to document her psychological responses as data for their ongoing research into the limits of human psychological manipulation and the possibility of creating enhanced human beings through multi-generational programming. Olivia realized with growing horror that even her current emotional devastation was being observed and analyzed by people who had spent decades studying her psychological patterns and predicting her responses to various forms of trauma and revelation. The investigation that had begun as her attempt to seek justice for forgotten victims had become the latest phase of an experiment that had been manipulating her life since before her birth, with researchers who viewed even her pursuit of truth as confirmation of their theories about psychological enhancement and behavioral conditioning. The revelation of her true identity as Subject 011 had left Olivia Jackson feeling like a stranger in her own skin. But she had underestimated how quickly Project Ether's operatives would respond to the compromise of their decades-long experiment. The drive back from the abandoned Serenity Hills facility had been conducted in tense silence, both she and Adam processing the implications of what they had discovered while remaining alert for any signs that they were being followed. The winding mountain roads provided perfect cover for surveillance, and Olivia's trained eye caught glimpses of vehicles that maintained suspicious distances behind them, always staying just far enough back to avoid detection by anyone less observant than a seasoned police detective. The first indication that their investigation had triggered active countermeasures came when they stopped for gas at a rural station 20 miles outside Willow Creek. Adam had gone inside to pay while Olivia remained with their vehicle, her instincts prickling with the uncomfortable sensation of being watched. The station's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the cracked asphalt, and the few other customers moved with the casual indifference of people going about their normal business. But something in the way a man in a dark sedan observed their movements while pretending to check his tire pressure made her hand move instinctively to her service weapon. The attack came with professional precision that confirmed her worst fears about who they were dealing with. As Adam emerged from the station's convenience store, two men in unmarked clothing approached from different angles, their movements coordinated with military efficiency. They made no attempt at subtlety. One produced a badge that looked official enough to fool casual observers, while the other positioned himself to block any escape routes. Their conversation was brief and conducted in voices too low for other customers to overhear, but their message was crystal clear. Adam Grant was being taken into custody on unspecified federal charges, and any attempt to interfere would result in additional consequences. Olivia's police training warred with her investigative instincts as she watched helplessly from behind the wheel of their car. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to intervene, to demand identification from these supposed federal agents, to use her authority as a local police detective to prevent what was obviously an illegal abduction. But the cold calculation that had made her successful as an investigator told her that revealing her presence would only result in her own capture, eliminating any possibility of mounting a rescue or continuing their investigation into Project Ether's ongoing operations. The men's professional handling of Adam's abduction revealed training that went far beyond typical law enforcement procedures. They moved him to their vehicle with the efficient brutality of people who had performed similar operations many times before, their actions suggesting military or intelligence backgrounds rather than conventional police work. As they drove away, leaving Olivia alone in the gas station parking lot with the terrible knowledge that her partner had been taken because of their investigation, she understood that Project Ether's reach extended far beyond the academic and medical institutions they had been investigating. The phone call came 6 hours later, as Olivia sat in her apartment trying to process the implications of Adam's abduction while planning her next move. The voice on the other end was electronically distorted but unmistakably authoritative, speaking with the calm confidence of someone who held all the cards in a deadly game that Olivia was only beginning to understand. The message was delivered with clinical precision. Adam Grant was alive, but would remain so only as long as Olivia cooperated with instructions that would be provided to her through secure channels. The caller's demands were specific and non-negotiable. All physical evidence related to Project Ether, including Sister Beatrice's journal, Dr. Croft's correspondence, and the files they had discovered at various abandoned facilities, was to be delivered to a location that would be specified within 24 hours. Additionally, all digital copies, photographs, and notes related to their investigation were to be destroyed under conditions that would allow Project Ether's operatives to verify their complete elimination. Any attempt to involve additional law enforcement personnel or to continue the investigation through other channels would result in Adam's immediate transfer to what the caller euphemistically described as a reclassification facility. The threat wasn't empty posturing. The caller demonstrated intimate knowledge of both Olivia's investigation and her personal history that could only have come from the surveillance files she had discovered in the Project Ether archives. They knew about her relationship with Adam, her professional reputation within the Willow Creek Police Department, and most disturbing of all, they had detailed information about her daily routines and personal vulnerabilities that suggested their monitoring of her life had intensified dramatically since her investigation began. Sitting in her apartment after the call ended, Olivia felt the full weight of her isolation settling around her like a physical presence. The files had revealed that her entire social and professional network had been penetrated by Project Ether operatives, making it impossible to determine who could be trusted and who might be reporting her activities to the very people she was trying to expose. Colleagues she had worked with for years, neighbors she had known since childhood, and even casual acquaintances could be part of the surveillance apparatus that had been monitoring her development since birth. The realization that she couldn't trust anyone in her normal support network forced Olivia to confront the true scope of Project Ether's power and influence. This wasn't simply a historical conspiracy that had been covered up. It was an active operation with resources that included government connections, law enforcement infiltration, and the ability to abduct federal investigators without triggering official inquiries. The people behind Adam's kidnapping operated with the confidence of individuals who knew they could act with impunity, protected by institutional authority that reached into the highest levels of government and law enforcement. Her apartment, which had always been a refuge from the stresses of police work, now felt like a trap where every shadow might conceal surveillance equipment, and every sound from the hallway could herald the arrival of operatives coming to complete her own abduction. The familiar surroundings that had provided comfort and security throughout her career had been transformed into a stage where her every move was being observed and analyzed by people who viewed her as an experimental subject rather than a human being deserving of privacy and autonomy. The psychological impact of learning that her entire life had been shaped by Project Ether's agenda was compounded by the immediate physical danger that now surrounded her investigation. The abstract horror of discovering that she had been monitored since birth became concrete and immediate when viewed through the lens of Adam's abduction and the threats that had been made against both their lives. The people who had orchestrated decades of child abuse and psychological experimentation were prepared to commit murder to protect their secrets, and they had demonstrated both the ability and willingness to reach anyone who threatened their operations. But as the hours passed and Olivia processed the full implications of her situation, she began to recognize that her unique position as both investigator and experimental subject provided her with advantages that Project Ether's operatives might not have anticipated. The psychological conditioning that had shaped her development had indeed created enhanced analytical abilities and an obsessive pursuit of truth. But those same traits made her capable of thinking several steps ahead of opponents who viewed her primarily through the lens of their clinical assessments and behavioral predictions. The surveillance files had documented her professional techniques and personal patterns with scientific precision. But they had also revealed the extent of Project Ether's operations and the identities of key personnel who had been involved in maintaining the conspiracy over decades. The same information that had shattered her sense of personal autonomy also provided her with detailed intelligence about her opponent's organizational structure, operational methods, and potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with sufficient determination and tactical skill. Project Ether's researchers had spent years studying her psychological profile and predicting her behavioral responses to various situations. But their clinical approach to understanding human motivation had potentially blinded them to the possibility that their experimental subject might possess the capacity for strategic thinking that exceeded their predictive models. The enhanced investigative abilities they had documented in her psychological assessments could be turned against them if she could overcome the emotional trauma of learning about her true origins and focus on the tactical advantages provided by her insider knowledge of their operations. The decision to fight back rather than surrender came not from anger or desperation, but from the cold realization that cooperation with Project Ether's demands would likely result in both her own death and Adam's elimination as a witness to their crimes. The people who had orchestrated Rebecca's memory reconstruction and decades of child abuse were not going to allow either of them to survive with knowledge that could expose the full scope of their operations, regardless of how completely they complied with the current demands for evidence destruction. Olivia's apartment became a strategic planning center as she began to prepare for what she understood would be a war fought against opponents who possessed superior resources but might be vulnerable to tactics they had not anticipated from someone they viewed primarily as a research subject. The psychological conditioning that had made her an effective police detective could be applied to dismantling the same network that had created those abilities, turning Project Ether's own success against them in ways that their clinical assessments had not predicted. The files they had discovered provided her with a comprehensive map of Project Ether's operations, including the locations of active facilities, the identities of key personnel, and the financial networks that had supported decades of illegal research. Most importantly, the correspondence they had found revealed that the conspiracy was not as monolithic as it appeared. There were internal tensions, competing priorities, and potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with sufficient knowledge and determination to wage asymmetric warfare against a seemingly overwhelming opponent. Standing in her kitchen as dawn light filtered through windows she now knew had been watched for decades, Olivia understood that the investigation that had begun with Sister Beatrice's hidden journal had transformed into something far more personal and dangerous than she had ever imagined. Project Ether's operatives had made a critical error in believing that their experimental subject would respond to threats with compliance rather than resistance, underestimating the possibility that their psychological conditioning had created not just enhanced investigative abilities, but the strategic thinking and emotional resilience necessary to wage war against the system that had created her. The hunt for truth about Grace Harbor's missing children had become a battle for survival against forces that had shaped her entire existence. But Olivia Jackson was no longer the unwitting experimental subject described in Project Ether's clinical assessments. She was a trained police detective with detailed intelligence about her opponent's operations and the tactical advantages that came from having nothing left to lose except the life that had never truly belonged to her anyway. The war Project Ether had started by abducting Adam Grant was about to become far more costly than their predictive models had anticipated. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Philadelphia bore no resemblance to the sterile medical facilities where Project Ether had conducted its decades of psychological experimentation. But Olivia Jackson recognized it immediately as the kind of location where desperate people made their final stands. The address had been provided through the same encrypted communication channel that had delivered Project Ether's ultimatum, and every instinct she possessed as a trained detective screamed that she was walking into a trap designed to eliminate the last witness to their crimes. But Adam Grant's life hung in the balance, and the files they had discovered provided her with tactical advantages that Project Ether's operatives might not have anticipated from their experimental subject. The industrial district surrounding the warehouse was a graveyard of American manufacturing, filled with empty buildings and rusted machinery that spoke of economic decline and forgotten dreams. The perfect location for activities that required isolation from curious observers, where screams would be absorbed by concrete walls and the disappearance of unwanted witnesses could be attributed to the random violence that plagued abandoned urban areas. Olivia approached the perimeter with the careful steps of someone who understood that survival depended on maintaining every possible advantage over opponents who possessed superior numbers and resources. The surveillance equipment she had borrowed from the police department's evidence locker revealed that the warehouse was being monitored by a sophisticated security system that included thermal imaging cameras, motion sensors, and communication equipment that suggested Project Ether's operatives had established a temporary command center within the building. The technological sophistication of their security measures confirmed that she was dealing with people who possessed government-level resources and training, but it also revealed potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with sufficient knowledge of their operational methods. The infiltration required every skill she had developed during her years as a police detective, combined with tactical knowledge she hadn't realized she possessed until the moment she needed it. Moving through the warehouse's exterior perimeter, avoiding security cameras and sensor arrays, Olivia found herself drawing on instincts that seemed to emerge from some deeper level of her consciousness. The enhanced analytical abilities that Project Ether had documented in their psychological assessments manifested as an almost supernatural awareness of her environment, allowing her to navigate through defenses that should have been impenetrable to someone with conventional training. Inside the warehouse, she discovered that Project Ether's temporary facility was more extensive than external surveillance had suggested. Multiple rooms had been equipped with medical monitoring equipment, computer terminals, and communication systems that could support extended operations. The clinical efficiency of the setup reminded her of the abandoned facilities they had investigated. But this location was clearly intended for active use rather than long-term storage of research subjects. The realization that Project Ether was prepared to conduct new experiments, potentially involving Adam or herself, added urgency to her mission that overcame any remaining hesitation about the risks she was taking. Finding Adam required systematic exploration of the facility's layout, while avoiding detection by the security teams that patrolled the corridors with military precision. His condition when she finally located him confirmed her worst fears about what Project Ether was prepared to do to protect their secrets. He had been subjected to pharmaceutical intervention designed to make him compliant and confused, his natural analytical abilities suppressed through chemical means that bore disturbing similarities to the memory reconstruction protocols they had discovered in Rebecca's files. The rescue operation demanded split-second timing and tactical precision that drew on resources Olivia hadn't known she possessed. As alarms began to sound throughout the facility, she found herself moving with enhanced speed and coordination that seemed to emerge from the same psychological conditioning that had shaped her investigative abilities. The pursuit through the warehouse corridors became a deadly game of cat and mouse, with Project Ether's operatives demonstrating the kind of training and equipment that confirmed their connections to intelligence and military organizations. But Olivia's greatest advantage wasn't her enhanced physical capabilities or her knowledge of the facility's layout. It was her understanding of Project Ether's psychological blind spots and the way their clinical approach to human behavior had made them predictable in their response to unexpected situations. The researchers who had spent decades studying her behavioral patterns had created detailed profiles of how she would respond to various stimuli, but their scientific methodology had failed to account for the possibility that their experimental subject might possess the capacity for strategic deception and tactical innovation that exceeded their predictive models. The escape from the warehouse was only the beginning of a more complex operation that would determine whether Project Ether's conspiracy could be exposed, or whether both she and Adam would become the latest victims of an organization that had successfully concealed its crimes for decades. During the months of planning that had preceded her infiltration of their facility, Olivia had prepared contingencies that would ensure the truth about Project Ether would be revealed, even if she didn't survive to see justice done. The dead man's switch she had established involved multiple redundant systems that would automatically release comprehensive documentation about Project Ether's operations if she failed to check in at predetermined intervals. Digital copies of every document they had discovered, detailed analysis of the conspiracy's organizational structure, and lists of personnel involved in decades of child abuse had been prepared for simultaneous release to news organizations, law enforcement agencies, and human rights organizations that possessed the resources and credibility to ensure the story would receive appropriate attention. The media exposure strategy had been carefully planned to maximize impact, while minimizing the possibility that Project Ether's government connections could suppress the story through classified national security claims or bureaucratic obstruction. By providing evidence to multiple outlets simultaneously, including international news organizations that operated beyond the reach of American government influence, Olivia had ensured that the conspiracy's exposure would be too widespread and well documented to be contained through conventional cover-up techniques. The first news reports appeared within hours of their escape from the warehouse, as journalists who had received comprehensive documentation began to verify the authenticity of documents that revealed systematic child abuse conducted under government sanction over multiple decades. The story exploded across traditional and social media platforms with the force of a revelation that challenged fundamental assumptions about institutional authority and the protection of vulnerable children within American society. Public reaction to the Project Ether revelations was immediate and overwhelming, with citizens expressing outrage that government agencies had not only failed to protect children from institutional abuse, but had actively participated in conducting psychological experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics and human rights. The documented evidence of systematic torture disguised as medical research, the manipulation of families through artificial personality reconstruction, and the multi-generational surveillance of experimental subjects created a scandal that reached into the highest levels of government and medical establishment. Congressional investigations were launched within days of the initial media reports, as elected officials recognized that the Project Ether scandal represented a political crisis that demanded immediate and visible response. The comprehensive documentation that Olivia had provided to journalists included financial records that traced government funding for the conspiracy, personnel files that identified officials who had authorized the research, and correspondence that revealed knowledge of the illegal activities at multiple levels of institutional hierarchy. The arrests began with lower-level operatives who had been directly involved in conducting experiments and maintaining surveillance networks, but the investigation quickly expanded to include medical professionals, government officials, and institutional administrators who had facilitated or concealed Project Ether's activities over multiple decades. The scope of the conspiracy, revealed through documents that provided detailed evidence of criminal activity, made it impossible for higher-level officials to claim ignorance of operations that had been conducted with their authorization and financial support. Adam's recovery from the pharmaceutical intervention he had endured during his captivity became a symbol of resilience and survival that resonated with media coverage of the broader scandal. His gradual return to full cognitive function, documented by medical professionals who had not been compromised by Project Ether connections, provided visible proof of the conspiracy's willingness to use experimental drugs on unwilling subjects and the potential for recovery from even severe psychological manipulation. The liberation of other survivors from active Project Ether facilities represented one of the most emotionally powerful aspects of the scandal's resolution. Adults who had been held in institutional settings for decades, their memories suppressed and identities reconstructed, began the difficult process of reclaiming their original personalities and reconnecting with families who had believed them dead for years. The reunion stories that emerged from these recoveries provided human faces for a conspiracy that might otherwise have seemed too abstract and clinical to generate sustained public attention. But for Olivia Jackson, the public vindication and media attention that followed Project Ether's exposure couldn't eliminate the psychological trauma of learning that her entire life had been shaped by forces she had never suspected existed. The enhanced investigative abilities that had made her successful as a police detective were revealed as products of deliberate psychological conditioning rather than natural talent, forcing her to question every aspect of her identity and professional achievements. The therapy sessions that followed her emergence as a public figure in the Project Ether scandal involved working with specialists who had no connection to the research networks that had monitored her development since birth. The process of untangling artificially implanted conditioning from her authentic personality traits required years of careful psychological work, as she struggled to determine which aspects of her identity represented genuine personal development and which had been shaped by external manipulation. Standing in her new apartment, paid for with proceeds from the book deal that had emerged from her role in exposing Project Ether, Olivia looked out at a city where she could finally live without constant surveillance for the first time since her birth. The knowledge that her enhanced abilities had been artificially created didn't diminish their value as tools for seeking justice and protecting vulnerable people, but it had transformed her understanding of personal autonomy and the meaning of individual achievement. The foundation she had established to support other Project Ether survivors represented her commitment to ensuring that the psychological techniques developed through decades of illegal research would be redirected toward healing rather than exploitation. Working with therapists and researchers who were committed to ethical practices, she had helped create treatment protocols that could assist survivors in recovering from memory reconstruction and artificial personality implantation, while respecting their right to determine their own identities and life paths. The civil lawsuits that followed the criminal prosecutions provided financial compensation for survivors and their families, but more importantly established legal precedents that would make it more difficult for similar conspiracies to operate with institutional protection in the future. The comprehensive reform of oversight mechanisms for psychological research, implemented in response to public outrage over Project Ether's activities, represented a systemic change that honored the suffering of victims while protecting future generations from similar exploitation. But as Olivia sat in her office, reviewing case files for the private investigation firm she had established to help families locate missing children and expose institutional abuse, she understood that her true victory wasn't the public recognition or financial compensation that had followed Project Ether's exposure. Her greatest achievement was the simple fact that she had broken free from a system designed to control every aspect of her existence, transforming from experimental subject to independent agent who could choose her own purpose and define her own identity. The enhanced investigative abilities that Project Ether had created through decades of psychological conditioning had indeed made her exceptionally effective at uncovering truth and seeking justice for vulnerable people. But the determination to use those abilities for protecting others rather than serving the agenda of her creators, represented a fundamental rejection of the conspiracy's attempt to shape her according to their specifications. She had become not what they intended to create, but what she chose to become. A person whose artificial origins couldn't diminish the authenticity of her commitment to justice and human dignity. We want to hear your opinion about this thrilling story. What do you think will happen with them? Tell us your name, where you are watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the new stories coming up. See you next time.